for you to know that Gary is from Scotland. So what he does is he creates and leads digital businesses, and he's now Group Director in Technology and Transformation at AKQA. Is that how you pronounce it?
That's it, yeah.
His talk is called There Is Nothing We Can Do, and I'm going to let him tell you all about it.
Thanks, Monica. Buna, semi-fash? Did I get that right? Close enough. Thank you. It's absolutely fantastic to be here. I had a fantastic trip in from the airport yesterday. A young chap, David, drove me in, and he was telling me all about Romania. And he told me in particular about a street full of nightclubs here in Cluj. And he said it's open every night of the week. It's fantastic. I said, would I be able to go, or are they younger than me? And he said, yeah, they're much younger than you, but there's no legal law against it. So it made me feel fantastic. So there's nothing we can do. I guess it sounds like quite a negative title. But by show of hands, does anyone here feel like in their businesses that they're working in, they sometimes felt like there's nothing they can do about the situation? It might be stakeholders pushing their particular demands. It could be senior management. It could be leadership teams. But sometimes, despite your best intentions and everything that you know that should be happening, it's virtually impossible to make these things come together. So what I wanted to do in today's talk was try and outline some opportunities and some things that you can do that certainly I've made mistakes with historically, but some models and some ways of thinking about things that have certainly helped me over the last few years. But I guess in order to give some context, it makes sense to go back to when I was a little bit younger. So this was me, age 10. It was a Christmas Day many, many years ago. And that was me. I just got my Commodore 64 from Santa Claus. And that was me just starting to teach myself how to program in BASIC. I was never much of a gamer. And to be honest, my parents at this point never really understood why I was interested in having a computer. But it became the start of quite a long career. Technology was moving quite fast then, though. So you move forward just 5 years. And this is actually, it took me ages to find this phone, but this is the actual phone that we had in the house when I was growing up. Now, I'd moved from this point from Commodore 64s to sitting in the room, and again, my parents not really knowing what it was I'm doing until they realized that they weren't getting phone calls coming into the house. They picked up the phone, and this is all I could hear. Because back in those days, of course, people had to arrange the phone in advance. There was no way that you could pick up a mobile phone. Moving forward again, this was me, a bit more 27 years old. Quite a scary setup here, and I hope nobody in the room has got a server room that looks like this. In fact, in some ways, I hope nobody has a server room these days. But this was kind of me moving into a professional career at this point, wires everywhere. But again, a very significant step in my life, and I have to admit, there are times where I've accidentally pulled the wrong cables at different times. But then you look at now, I'm not going to reveal my age. David's already made me feel bad enough about that. But what you see here is my youngest daughter, Erica. She's about to turn 2 now, but she's already getting really quite handy with a mobile phone. And then you've got Erin. She's about to turn 8 now. She's got a tablet. So that Commodore 64 now is right in her hands, and she's actually been learning to program. To be honest, some of her programming is a bit better than mine these days. I'm a bit too far from it. Granddad's even getting in on the action. You know, he's reading his books on his e-reader. Alexa's sitting somewhere behind everybody, just waiting on that call to kick in and do something, or listen to see what they can advertise to us next time we're in Chrome. Sonos, behind, obviously wired up to the television, and everything, of course, happening over Wi-Fi. Now, this is a massive, massive change from where we were back in the Commodore 64, or the dial-up days, or when I was pulling the wrong cables out of the servers. It's a massive change, and the world that my kids are going to grow up in is significantly different because software is eating the world. And this has got a massive impact on all areas of the business that we work in because it's absolutely consuming many, many layers of supply chain. Let me give you an example of that. So the media industry, of course, is all about making money from advertising. But in order for a simple newspaper to do that, they have to have a journalist who can write it. Then they need to go through some fairly extensive fact-checking. They have to buy paper. They have to do the printing. They've got a massive distribution and logistics setup just to get that newspaper in someone's hands. And of course, we skip right over that now. With a little bit of software that we can work on, we get Facebook in someone's hands. It's very easy for people to express views, whether or not we agree with those views. And it's very easy for other people to tune in and listen, and for the companies to get advertising out there. So another example, for people who perhaps are in the taxi industry, it used to be that taxis would have to be built. Then at some point, of course, they'd have to go and purchase those taxis. Then they're going to have to employ people to drive the taxis, or possibly even to work in call centers to take calls. And eventually, hopefully, someone is going to take your taxi to some destination. Of course, that's very different now. We've got Uber right in our hands. It's software. That whole supply chain all gets disintermediated, and it all comes down to a thin layer of technology that's sitting in your hands. I'll give you one final example. If you're in the hospitality industry, or in particular in hotels, it used to be that you would take a long, long time to locate where you wanted your hotel to be. You would then have to design that. You're going to have to go ahead and construct, which in itself is going to take probably quite a few months, if not years. And you're going to have to recruit people to work in your hotel. You're going to have to start advertising and promoting. And somewhere after a number of years, probably, hopefully people are going to turn up at your hotel. And again, thanks to technology in our hands, and the same technology that my kids are growing up with, it's all in your hand now. And for Airbnb to add a new hotel or a new property to their estate, it takes approximately 10 minutes for someone to sign up. I know that because this is my wife's mum and dad. And they did this fairly recently. It took them about 10, 15 minutes to go through the process and sign up. They now have people coming to stay with them in Belfast so that they can make some extra cash from some capacity that they have in their house. The other interesting thing with this, though, is Peter and Catherine, for me, they're good examples of people who are at a stage in their life where they're still at the very senior positions in the organizations that many of us probably work in. It's a very different world that they've grown up in, and being used to managing big supply chains, to the world now where you can completely disintermediate a company with a little bit of software in the palm of your hand. This becomes really important for all of us in this room, because if you look at some basic numbers, the baby boomers, people like Peter and Catherine, who are 55 to 73 years old, they make up approximately 18% of the senior management positions in our businesses. And these are the very most senior positions. These are chief execs, C-suite type people. You come down a generation, the generation I'm kind of tipping into, Gen X, you've got 62% of the leadership and management positions are in that category. So between those two alone, a massive 80% of the leadership of the organizations and enterprises we work with are in that category. They're not digital natives. We're only starting to creep into that territory now, and I guess with many of you in this room, as we start to look at millennials. And that's a tiny, tiny part of that leadership in that organization. And that's before you consider, and I'm sure there's many of you in this room as well, Generation Z, the younger generation, are coming into the workforce as well. Over 50% of the workforce just now is millennials or Generation Z. So that makes it very, very difficult for us in this room who've grown up in a different environment, understanding technology differently, not expecting wires, not expecting server rooms with lots of different cables, expecting everything to be in the cloud, and expecting to move at a huge amount of pace so that we can test things with customers all day, every day. So what do you do? And coming back, just to reinforce that, some of the applications that we spoke about before, when you look at when they've come into market, they're all coming in round about the time. In this case, the iPhone for the Generation Z. You've got Netflix and subscription models. Even some of the longer-standing companies like your Googles and your Amazons, they've been around all throughout the time of millennials. Going back even further, right at that seed point of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee came up with that around 30 years ago. So for people like Peter and Catherine, they really don't have a huge understanding of how do you do this effectively in the enterprise. This is how this manifests. So you've got a company like Apple. They've invested and they're really, really good at this stuff. Google, of course, fantastic. Then you've got some really excited leaders in many of our companies who are forcing lots of different features in there with the best of intentions, knowing exactly what customers want, but it doesn't always quite work out that way. Ultimately, we've got 21st century internet-enabled business processes, we've got 20th century management processes. Ultimately, we've got 19th century management principles, because this is when these people built their careers. This is when they built the organizations. This takes a long, long time to change. So what can we do? Now, the example I'm going to give now is actually one where I had the fantastic opportunity where I lived this twice. The first time, I messed it up terribly, really, really badly, and I'll describe that situation to you. I got the opportunity to come back to the same organization a couple of years later, and by that point, I think I'd learned a few more tricks, I had a few more models to think about how you can change things despite many of those kind of organizational structures and practices and processes that are buried in. And hopefully, some of this will help give you some tools and some ways of thinking about problems that's going to make a big difference when you face those problems in your own workplaces. So I joined a company quite a few years ago now. My own background, as you'll guess from the Commodore 64 when I was 10 years old, is from a technology perspective. So I spent a number of years working in technology change and then starting to come into business change. So I joined this company, which was in a very traditional industry, but really wanting to get good at building digital products and services to support their kind of traditional existing physical products. So in joining the organization, I found out that there was a major initiative that was underway, a particular product that they felt was business critical. It had to go out the door by a certain time frame. All of the organizational resources were being thrown at this thing. And of course, as soon as I said, can I see it in production? Where can I play with it? It turned out this had been worked on for many, many months, and it was still sitting in developers' machines. There was nothing in production. There was nothing that could be shown to customers. There was nothing automated. There was no wonderful single click to get all the way out to production. It was a really quite painful situation for something that was apparently business critical. So I pulled together a new team. Fortunately, this was quite naturally constrained to this product. And over a period of a few months, we started to evolve the architecture within this product, the technical architectures, to a point where we could adopt full-on continuous delivery. We were able to A/B test. It got to a really mature position, and we started to be a little bit less worried about that particular product. But that's not where the risk happened. The risk for me really happened at the next stage. Because what I wanted to do was take the change that we'd achieved for that particular area and start to roll this out across the wider enterprise. Now, all of the signs were positive. Everyone nodded and smiled and said, Gary, brilliant idea. We love this. It's absolutely the way forward. I spent quite a long time planning out how this was going to go. For me, it was an absolute no-brainer. All the logic was there. I'd made the arguments. I pointed out clearly to people why their way was wrong and why there was a much better way of doing it. And then it hit me really, really, really quite hard at the point when I realized that nobody was going to proceed with this. It all got pushed away into the side, and there was no more work for me at that point with that company. It really didn't make any sense at all. And I started to realize that all of those structures and practices and processes and all of those people from more traditional backgrounds, their careers depend on that. Their positions within the organization depend on it. All of the people within the organization who want to get promoted, even in not as senior positions, depend on the approval of all those people that are holding those top positions. So there was no way that I was going to be able to convince them to take that different step. It was way, way, way too risky, despite the fact that for me, all of those signs appeared to be really, really positive. So that really confused me, and I went on, worked with a few more companies over a period of time, and then I got the opportunity to come back at a later stage. And this time, ultimately, we achieved what I had wanted to achieve in the first place, but we took a very, very different approach, and it was significantly more successful. So I'll start to introduce some of these things just now. As I say, I'm not saying that you should go and do each of these things. What I'm saying is these are mental models that allow me to think differently about the problem within that organization, allow me to approach it differently, and ultimately helped us to be much more successful. What I've also done with each of these different things, there's 5 of them in total, is I've put the name there, but I've also put the name of the person if you want to go away and look up more about this and understand what you can do with it yourself. You'll be able to get that information as well. So the very first thing, and this is really at quite a high level, is something called scaling edges by a guy called John Hagel. And the scaling edges approach is very, very counter to how you tend to see change programs happening in an enterprise. So what Hagel says is, or what the traditional approach would be, if this is an organization and each of these circles are different initiatives or programs or developments of different kinds within the organization, quite often what people want to do, whether or not it's for their own kind of benefit or whether it's because it's the only way to get funding to do what you need, is to build a plan that's going to incorporate absolutely everything. If you run headfirst into absolutely everything, you'll get approval, you'll be the hero, everything's going to be wonderful. I've never seen it be wonderful. And that's one of the big issues that I made that first time round. And what Hagel says about scaling edges really is what you want to do is you want to find a tiny, tiny part within the enterprise, a tiny thing that is probably underfunded. It doesn't get a huge amount of attention. It's not one of these political hot topics or social hot topics within the organization, but that becomes your starting point. So you're going to scope this down as small as you can, find something really, really small. And only then, once you're having success at that level, you're going to start to grow out. You're going to find the people in the organization who they're really interested in the ways of working, or they want to support, or they want to get involved. They're really ideologically aligned with what you're attempting to do, or other projects that are perhaps kind of closely related. You're going to gradually grow these out through time. The starting with this small approach, it seems counterintuitive, but once you work with that over a period of time, what you find is you're able to scale that and be much more successful much quicker. So that's number one, scaling edges. So the second one here really is, I'd say it's more of a management model or more of a way of thinking. And this has got Japanese origins. It's called nemowashi. Now, in Japan, they've got this phenomenal capability to take huge, grown, mature trees and transplant them into different locations. But in order to do that, what they have to do is very, very carefully work consistently all around the root base, digging down deep, being able to trim out all the main roots. And then once all of that groundwork is done and the preparation is done in the next area where it's going to go to, they're able to lift that tree and they're able to take it to the new location. And the whole nemowashi way of thinking about things is, if you don't do the groundwork, if you don't get the ground effectively prepared and you don't get the root ball of the tree effectively prepared, then you're probably going to find that tree is going to die. It's not going to flourish in its destination where it goes. The Japanese have taken this concept and they've applied it to management, because Japanese management models are very consensus driven. So if you're working in Japan and if you have an idea that you want to take forward, if you don't spend the time making sure you speak to all the people involved, making sure you get their perspectives and making sure you consult them in an appropriate way, it's probably going to get shut down at a very, very early stage because it's socially unacceptable. So this concept here, this is another thing where I struggled the first time round when I tried to make that change in that organization. Again, I went in with what I believe were all the right logical arguments, and I was able to point out what should be done. But what I hadn't done is spent the necessary time speaking to all the different people that would be involved and would be affected, understanding what their motivations, what did they need to achieve within the organization, and understanding how this was going to work for them. It sounds really, really simple, but realistically, I see very, very few people in enterprises doing this. We get quite quick to throw things over the wall and say who's doing things wrong, but very few times do I see people putting in the legwork to talk to all of the people involved and actually get that decision made well in advance of the decision point. As the old saying goes, never drop a bombshell in the boardroom. So the third approach is what's known as Shook's model for cultural change. So John Shook, he worked with GM many years ago, and this was at a point when NUMMI was coming about. So this was going to be a joint collaboration between GM and Toyota. So John Shook got to go and spend time with Toyota and really start to learn about Toyota production system. And he reported on much of this when he came back from his time spent there. And one of the big learnings that he had was that the way that we talk about culture and evolving culture in our organizations is often quite wrong. So what the Japanese do, how they think about things, is they want to change people's behavior, which in turn will change people's values and attitudes, which in turn will evolve your culture. But that's very, very different to how we tend to think about these things in our part of the country, and certainly across Europe. What we tend to do is we want to sit people down with a great big PowerPoint presentation. We want to tell them what their new culture is going to be. We want to demand to them that they're going to report on all these new ways of thinking and working. And of course, we assume that that's going to make their culture completely different. And it doesn't work that way. So in terms of applying Shook's model for cultural change, really what we're doing is we're saying, if we're going to start to evolve the culture in our organizations, if we want to get people thinking differently and ultimately taking different decisions, and for example, moving from big upfront plans to being able to test things and move quickly with customers on an ongoing basis, then we need to get people to experience that firsthand. We need them to leave behind some of their experiences that they've learned for many, many years and take a whole new approach. So Shook's model ultimately is about changing how we behave, creating an environment that allows us to do different things, rather than starting from a point of preaching and presentation. So that's fantastic, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about how do you change people's behavior. So change behavior will change culture, but how do you actually change behavior? So it brings us on to our fourth model, which is called Fogg's behavior model. And one of the things Fogg's spoken about for many years, he's a really interesting chap. He actually started researching in the space of persuasive technology. So this was long before the time of social media being used to influence political campaigns and stuff. He's been researching this for a long time. And what he came up with is the fact that behavior, if you want to change behavior, there are three things that need to come together all at the same time. There has to be, firstly, motivation. There has to be ability. And there has to be a trigger, something that's going to cause that behavior to happen. And how he visualizes that is like this. So you've got ability on the x-axis. So things could be all the way from easy down to hard. And then on the motivation axis, you've got high motivation and you've got low motivation. Now, naturally, you need all these triggers that are going to make different things happen, and we need to be able to build them into our environment. But the real thing here is Fogg says that if things are difficult to do, things are difficult to achieve, so for example, when I was working with that organization, I proposed a very big change that seemed just way, way, way too difficult for the people in that organization to work with. If that's difficult, then the motivation, if they're going to be successful, has to be exceptionally high. The problem is it's very, very difficult to affect people's motivation. People are caught up with their own lives, they're caught up with their own ways of working, they're caught up with their own targets and all the politics and social things within the organization. So realistically, there is very little you can do to affect people's motivation to do something within the organization. So instead, the more effective thing to do is start to take that time to understand what the motivations of people already are, and then work with those motivations rather than try to instill new motivation within people. So by doing that, by working with people's motivation, and then the second thing is by simplifying things as far as possible, you start to be able to affect people's behavior. Now, the thing about simplicity and making things as easy to do as possible is simple. What is simple to someone like Fogg is much, much simpler than what we would probably think about. So if you really want to affect change in the organization, You have to go with tiny, tiny, tiny things, really, really simple things that are clearly aligned to existing motivations within the organization. If you're able to do that, then you will be able to get people to change things on a regular behavior if the triggers are there on a regular basis. If we don't do that, unfortunately, if the motivation isn't high enough, or if the ability isn't good enough to be able to do it, then unfortunately the triggers are going to fail. The fifth and final model, and this is one that I've found particularly useful for quite a few years, comes from a chap called Dave Snowden, Professor Dave Snowden. And he's from Wales in the UK. I've put it up here as Cynefin, because Cynefin is Dave Snowden's sense-making framework. And he uses that essentially to help you look at the types of problems that you're dealing with, and then understand the management or leadership approaches that you should take in order to be able to effectively deal in that situation. Now, the reality is, affecting people's behavior within the enterprise or within an organization and getting them to change how they tackle things and move them towards the way that you want to do it, that is a complex thing. So essentially, what you're looking at here is complicated and obvious. The things on this side of the sense-making framework, they're ordered. You can plan for those things. They're predictable. So Gantt charts can be effective if you want to use a Gantt chart. But the things on the other side, certainly complexity, you can't plan for those things. All of you in this room, you've got your own identity, you've got your own intent, you've got your own intellect. You know, if I were to ask you something today, I might get a very different answer from if I ask you the same thing tomorrow. There are unknown unknowns, and I can't predict what they are. So really, although I'm citing Cynefin here in Dave Snowden's framework, really what I'm talking about is the practice of experimentation. If you want to know what people's motivations are, or you want to know how people are going to react to different changes that you propose making in the enterprise, the only way that you can do that really is to try a tiny little experiment, or a probe as Dave Snowden would call it, sense what the response is from that experiment, and then if it's something that you want to happen, then you can respond by amplifying that thing and doing more of it. If it's something you don't want to happen, then you can respond by dampening it and stepping back, doing less of that thing. His framework, unfortunately, is quite academic. Sometimes I find it's not particularly accessible. So I came up with this a while ago, and it tries to start to explain it in a little bit more specific detail. So the traditional approaches to management and leadership in the enterprise and many of our organizations are more like this. If you want to get to the top of that mountain, if you want to achieve some particular objective, then the steps that you need to do and the things that you need to do are usually quite clearly specified. So for example, you might need to report to an architecture board. You might need to get a certain approval from key stakeholders. You might need to use certain technologies. You know, there's a pile of things that are already baked in stone. And in slower moving worlds, that's completely acceptable. You know, in manufacturing terms, it's good that we have managers who are able to break things down into simple terms, really, really focus on efficiency and specification, and then be able to move as quickly as possible through that. But the world that we're living in, where we need to get customer feedback as quickly as possible, and we need to move at significantly more pace, then this is too restrictive. Because if something happens, if you meet a bear halfway up the mountain, or if a storm hits or an avalanche comes down, there's absolutely nothing that you can do about that. You have to be able to change the way that you want to go about doing things. In the same way as within a product team, if you're starting to test different concepts or A/B tests, you need to be able to react to that feedback. You can't just follow the same pattern and follow by rote the same things that the stakeholders would be saying. So an alternative approach that you can take here when you're trying to evolve people's behavior in the enterprise is called applying enabling constraints rather than the governing constraints. So here what we say is, rather than specifying exactly how you should do things, what we're going to do is we're going to specify the things that you absolutely must not do. So for example, with some of the product teams I work with, some of the constraints that we put in place are, don't go any more than 5 days without having customer feedback on whatever you're working on. Don't deploy to a production environment without having the ability to measure impact. And don't deploy less than once per day. And those three things sound very, very simple. But actually, when you apply them together in conjunction, actually what you get is truly agile teams, as opposed to being agile by methodology. It doesn't say anything about stand-ups. It doesn't say anything about how you construct stories. It doesn't say anything about any of the practice and ceremony that's ongoing. But what it does do is, by focusing on doing these things, your team has to be able to respond very quickly to change. So the experimentation part now starts to come in, because we've not told them how to achieve something. What we're saying is, you can go about figuring out how you're going to achieve this. So how are you going to be able to deploy to production every day? Is there actually a platform or a system or a stakeholder that's preventing that type of behavior happening? Then you're going to have to be able to experiment around that. So if you take a look at the governing constraints approach that we looked at before, where everything is specified very, very particularly in advance, once you start to look at how does the specification that the organization has told you to do compare to the enabling constraints that you've said that the team should try to avoid getting to. And then when you hit that point, then the teams are able to then experiment around those different approaches to doing that thing. So one example of this, a true example of this from a client I worked with, again, a few years ago. This came about through that ability to measure the impact within the product. So the team was starting, there was a fairly young team, they were starting to move at pace, but we had this limitation of they can't deploy to production without measuring impact. What they realized quite quickly was the analytics platforms that would allow them to measure that type of impact sat within a completely different department in the enterprise. So they had some platforms and systems that they used here, an entirely different part of the organization owning the data and being able to feed back. Now, that department was very helpful. Whenever they reached out and said, could you help us constructing a report on some of these things, the audience said, yeah, sure, we'll get back to you in 6 weeks' time. You're coming up top of the queue. It made it impossible for them to be able to do any of those enabling constraints whatsoever. So what they experimented there, they tried quite a few things. So first of all, they said, well, can you give us a username and a password to those platforms, and we can do that ourselves. And that was completely unacceptable, of course. They considered, what if we actually brought up our own versions of the platforms? Could we gather all of the data that we want to do ourselves? Which they tried for a while, they were able to do it. But actually then joining the data together from different platforms became really quite difficult. The thing that they finally arrived at was to work with that other department to say, we want to recruit an analyst who will work within the product team, but you actually get to be involved in the recruitment process. So it's essentially somebody that you have approved to be here full-time, working within the team, so you get the best of what you need, but we get the responsiveness and the removal of an external constraint, and we're able to move at pace. That worked really effectively. And from that point on, once that worked out, we tried out over a 2-month period, and then all of the rest of the product teams in that business then started to adopt analysts within their team that were approved by that other department, so they had access to all of those platforms, and the throughput got significantly greater. But the key thing here is not about what the solution was. The key thing here is about the teams and the people experimenting with things to be able to identify what are alternative ways to do this that could potentially be effective. And of course, we all know that if we're focusing on flow in product development, as soon as you remove one constraint, all you're going to do is reveal what the second biggest constraint was. So this becomes a continuous process. This is something that has to be built into the culture of your teams and the culture of the people. It's a very different way of thinking to the generations of people in very senior positions quite often. But the reality is, if you break those little changes down small enough, you can experiment with all of these things on an ongoing basis. And eventually, you get to your target. So that was the 5 different models that I've kind of picked up over maybe the last 5-10 years or so. Like I say, they're just ways of thinking about things. The idea here isn't to say you should go and apply these things. My point really is to say that when you're in the organization, when you're in the enterprise, and there's leaders saying this, and the stakeholders saying this, and there's governing boards saying this, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything. There are different things and different approaches that you can try. There's different things that you can take steps towards trying new ways of working. And you'd be surprised, actually, when you start to bend those rules, you start to move in that direction, you're actually really quite surprised how quickly things become normal. They become acceptable. And you start to get much higher performing product teams in a very different organization. Thank you.